A black math prodigy from Harlem walks into Cambridge's oldest lecture hall, and every student goes silent. Professor Crowley smirks, then challenges him with a 22-year unsolvable equation, the same one that destroyed a forgotten black genius decades ago. Malik's chalk screeches across the board and skips a step. The room gasps, but before he finishes, Crowley stands and says coldly, "This ends here." Why would a tenured professor silence a solution that could change history? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the soft gray light of an English morning, the great stone arches of Cambridge stood quiet and intimidating, like ancient judges guarding knowledge meant only for a chosen few. The air was crisp, and inside the hallowed halls of the Department of Mathematical Sciences, the silence was less about focus and more about exclusion. The architecture didn't just preserve history, it enforced it. Generations of minds had come and gone, mostly white, mostly elite, their portraits still hanging above the arched windows like silent warnings of who had a right to belong. When Malik Jensen first walked through the heavy oak doors of Lecture Hall 4B, time seemed to pause. The room was already full, rows of students in blazers and leather-bound notebooks, all seated with the quiet confidence of those born into legacy. Heads turned, but no one spoke. Their eyes said enough. His skin, his sneakers, even the Bronx-laced rhythm in his walk, felt like violations in a room not built for him. Malik didn't hesitate. He had seen this look before, on train platforms, in gifted programs, at airport security, but this time it was sharper. Here, the prejudice wore a tweed jacket and a doctorate. The chalkboard at the front bore dense equations, not yet wiped from the previous session. In the center of the room stood Professor Thaddeus Crowley, a man who carried his reputation like armor. His lectures were rarely challenged and never interrupted. His name had been etched into multiple math journals. To students, he was revered. To faculty, he was untouchable. But to Malik, he was just another test. Crowley gave no nod, no welcome, just a flick of his eyes across Malik's face, as if registering an unexpected variable in a formula that should have been perfectly balanced. He resumed his lecture without pause, diving into higher-order tensors, fractals, and nonlinear systems, with the cold detachment of someone used to being the smartest man in the room. Malik chose a seat in the front. Not to be seen, but to see everything. The lecture moved fast. Crowley spoke with the clipped precision of someone used to being quoted. The students around Malik nodded with robotic familiarity, scribbling notes more out of ritual than understanding. But Malik didn't need to write anything down. His mind moved faster than chalk. While others absorbed, he dissected. From the corners of the room, the whispers started, not loud enough to interrupt, but clear enough to isolate. "Exchange student," someone muttered under breath. "Quota kid," another smirked. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. If they were trying to rattle him, they were already behind. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here because he had earned his place through sweat, silence, and sleepless nights in a one-bedroom apartment, with peeling paint and a mother who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Crowley's chalk screeched louder than necessary, as he paused at the board, facing the students. He announced the topic of the next segment, a discussion on mathematical limits and convergence, something even advanced students often struggled to conceptualize. But then, with a calculated breath, he veered. There was a beat of hesitation, and then Crowley introduced a problem. Not just any problem, but the problem. He called it the limit that defines the impossible, a phrase that sounded academic but carried thorns. The problem had no official solution. It wasn't part of the curriculum. It hadn't even been mentioned in any published work for 2 decades. But those in the know recognized it instantly. It was Crowley's limit, a theorem so dense, so unapproachable, that even doctoral candidates avoided it. The room stiffened. This wasn't on the syllabus. Why bring it up now? Malik's brow furrowed. He had read about this problem once, in an obscure thread buried in a math forum. No diagrams, just skepticism and pride. The limit had become an internal test among Cambridge's elite. A problem tossed out not to be solved, but to separate the good from the great, and the great from the rest. Crowley's eyes swept the room. But when they landed on Malik, they didn't move. He lingered, just long enough for everyone to feel it. It wasn't just a glance. It was a challenge. One not given out of academic curiosity, but out of condescension. The air grew tighter. Malik's mind began to spin, not from fear but from recognition. He had seen this tactic before. A problem dropped like a gauntlet, cloaked in politeness but dripping in quiet racism. It wasn't an invitation to solve. It was bait. A setup designed to humiliate. If Malik attempted it and failed, he'd confirm every stereotype they whispered. If he ignored it, they'd call him out as unworthy of real rigor. Either way, the trap was set. But there was one thing Crowley hadn't calculated for. Malik didn't play by their rules. He leaned back in his chair, allowing the problem to marinate in his mind like a puzzle craving completion. He didn't need validation. The numbers themselves would reveal whether the challenge was worth his attention. And even as the lecture continued and pens resumed their scratching, Malik had already begun solving the limit, not with formulas but with focus. The rest of the students sat oblivious, unaware that the real lecture had just begun, and its stakes were far higher than grades. Because Malik wasn't just a student trying to learn. He was a prodigy trying to prove that sometimes the rooms you're told you don't belong in are exactly the ones you were born to change. And as the chalk dust settled, Crowley smiled faintly. Just for a second, he had no idea what he had just started. Crowley, with deliberate subtlety, added, "Of course, the limit is unsolvable," before underlining it on the board, and locking eyes with Malik, holding his stare longer than necessary, as if daring him to try. The moment the lecture ended, the room emptied with the same stiff choreography that had greeted Malik the moment he arrived. Students packed their polished satchels, their shoes clicking neatly against the stone floor, as they drifted toward the exits in small clusters that never included him. No one spoke to him, but their silence carried the weight of unspoken expectation. They knew the rule of this place, long before he stepped foot in it. Some students were meant to rise, others were meant to remain invisible. Yet Malik stayed seated. The unresolved challenge circled in his mind like a figure-8 loop he couldn't look away from. Crowley's limit, the unsolvable theorem, didn't strike him as impossible. It struck him as suspicious, not because of its complexity, but because of its purpose. Something in the way Crowley had presented it, in the deliberate pause, in the slow underlining of the words on the board, felt less like instruction and more like provocation. Malik began pulling out his notebook, the worn cover creased from long nights on the subway, on his bed, in dim corners of libraries. It had followed him through competitions and classrooms, through tests he was never meant to pass. He opened to a blank page and started sketching lines and variables, reconnecting the pieces of the theorem from memory. He barely noticed the students who lingered near the door, watching him the way spectators might watch a magician attempt a trick they were sure would fail. Some exchanged low remarks, muffled but not enough to hide the condescension. Their expressions carried a blend of amusement and suspicion, as if Malik's presence turned the room into a social experiment, one they assumed would end in humiliation. But Malik felt none of their confidence. Instead, he felt an old sensation, one that always rose in him whenever someone dared to underestimate him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride, it was a quiet fire, a deep breath kind of resolve that whispered that if someone tried to take space from him, he would simply create more. He leaned forward, pen tapping against the edge of the paper, as he reviewed the first barrier of Crowley's limit. The structure of the problem was deceptively simple on the surface, a series of nested boundary conditions wrapped in layered constraints, each requiring not only precision but an instinctual sense for mathematical behavior. He could see why others had failed. The theorem wasn't one problem, it was several problems disguised as one. But beneath its complexity was something else. Something he had felt the moment Crowley's gaze had landed on him. This wasn't an academic test. This was an initiation ritual, and he wasn't meant to survive it. Around him whispers grew. Students passed by with smirks tugging at their mouths. Some muttered the same tired assumptions he had grown up hearing. Others mocked him under their breath with words that floated through the air like quiet darts. None of them said anything outright, but racism didn't need volume to be effective. Still, Malik kept writing. With every stroke of his pen, he refused the limitations they tried to impose. He watched the variables fall into patterns that only a mind like his could catch. Patterns that flickered like soft constellations waiting for someone brave enough to connect them. He felt the first layer of the theorem begin to unravel, revealing an inconsistency tucked within a boundary condition. It wasn't an error, it was strategy. Someone, years ago, had crafted the limit not to be solved, but to appear eternally out of reach. He wondered whether anyone else had noticed it, Or if only people like him, outsiders who had clawed their way into elite rooms, were forced to look for the flaws that others chose to ignore. As he continued, he sensed movement. Professor Crowley stepped down from the front of the lecture hall, with the slow, deliberate motion of someone accustomed to control. His footsteps were barely audible, but Malik felt each one like a shift in atmospheric pressure. Crowley passed quietly between the rows of empty seats, his polished shoes reflecting the faint light from the high-arched windows. Students near the doorway stilled, watching. Even they couldn't predict what would happen next. Crowley rarely acknowledged students outside of lecture material. He certainly never approached them after class. But today was different. Today, he had something to prove. Malik kept writing, aware of Crowley drawing closer, but refusing to let it interrupt his focus. The second layer of the theorem was unfolding before him, more intricate than he expected, yet still within reach. He alternated between equations and intuition, between structure and instinct. The more he worked, the more Crowley's limit resembled a locked door whose hinges were rusting with age. But just as Malik completed a crucial line connecting two variables that were never meant to touch, a shadow fell across his notebook. Crowley had stopped directly beside him. Malik didn't look up immediately. His pen moved with the tense grace of someone who knew he was being watched, but refused to stop performing. He reached for the next symbol, the next fragment of the solution that would anchor his progress. That was when he heard it.
Not a lecture tone. Not an academic critique. Not a question.
A statement. Cold. Low. Personal. It was the kind of statement spoken not to instruct but to diminish. The kind meant to remind someone of the life they came from, as if their origin was a stain rather than a testament. Crowley's words held the sharpness of a blade wrapped in velvet, slicing quietly, insidiously, designed to leave no physical evidence but plenty of emotional scars. Malik's pen halted mid-stroke. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden surge of clarity he felt. In that moment, the entire strategy behind Crowley's limit clicked into place. It wasn't simply a test of intelligence. It was a test of endurance, a test of whether someone like him could withstand humiliation and still rise. Crowley stood inches away, waiting for the impact of his words to settle. He expected Malik to shrink, to fold inward, to show that the academic cage had worked exactly as intended. He expected shame, confusion, or even silent retreat. But Malik didn't give him any of those things. He remained still, frozen not by intimidation but by realization. He suddenly understood the real reason Crowley had presented the theorem during that lecture, and locked eyes with him as he underlined the word unsolvable. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't spontaneous academic curiosity.
This had been planned.
Crowley had chosen this moment, this lecture, this problem, this timing, because the class was full, because the challenge would be public, because the failure would be memorable. For Malik, and for everyone else watching. The students near the door leaned in, sensing tension thickening the air. Some of them exchanged glances, tinged with discomfort. Others looked eager, waiting to see if the spectacle would unfold the way they expected. In elite spaces, racism often came dressed as rigor, and today, cruelty disguised itself as education. Malik stared down at the half-finished equation, the lines of ink glowing faintly under the vaulted lights. He could feel the weight of the moment, pressing on his shoulders, a familiar burden he had carried since childhood. Yet he also felt the pull of something deeper, a restless certainty that everything happening in this room was pushing him toward a path he had not yet fully understood. He lifted his eyes slowly. Crowley was watching him with a composure so polished it almost looked hollow. But beneath that veneer was fear. Not fear of Malik, but fear of what Malik represented. A disruption to the hierarchy Crowley had built his entire career upon. Malik exhaled, steady and silent. He didn't speak. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His stillness was answer enough. And Crowley saw it. For the first time, the professor's expression faltered. Not enough for the watching students to notice, but enough that Malik caught the flicker of irritation, the subtle unease of someone realizing their target wasn't breaking the way they expected. Before Malik could react further, Crowley leaned closer, lowering his voice into a private strike, meant only for him. The words were sharper this time, more pointed, more dismissive, again evoking Malik's neighborhood, his upbringing, the stereotype Crowley believed would anchor him in place. The sentence landed with surgical cruelty, and as the final word echoed through Malik's thoughts, His pen slipped slightly in his fingers. His grip tightened around it, and then it froze. Malik's pen remained suspended above the notebook, as the weight of Crowley's quiet threat crushed the air between them, leaving Malik in a moment where he had to decide whether to finish the equation or let Crowley's words define him. The chill of the Cambridge night seeped through the stained glass windows, like a slow reminder of everything Malik didn't belong to. The halls emptied quickly after lectures, students vanishing into their private dormitories or elite study groups, where accents matched legacy and laughter flowed like coded approval. Malik often found himself alone by design and by default. He returned to his dorm room each evening with the quiet resolve of someone who had no choice but to carry the weight alone. The room was small, tucked at the edge of a building too historic to be comfortable. The desk lamp flickered when overused, and the radiator hissed with an indifference that matched most of the faculty. Still, Malik called it his sanctuary. While others spent their nights at pub socials or faculty dinners, Malik buried himself beneath a mountain of old equations, tattered notes, and scattered notebooks, filled with rough sketches of the theorem that refused to leave his mind. Crowley's limit was more than a challenge now. It had become an obsession, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because something about it didn't sit right. There was a quiet dishonesty in the logic. Malik could feel it, not in any formal proof, but in the small inconsistencies that crept through its structure like hairline fractures in glass. He worked with surgical focus. No distractions, just patterns. His fingers moved instinctively, drawing and redrawing sequences, pulling old solutions from memory, testing variations, and eliminating dead ends. Every now and then a spark would flare, one that made him sit up straighter, breathe slower, knowing he had just carved away another layer of the impossible. But with each inch of progress, the resistance around him grew colder. In classes, the students who once gave half nods of polite distance now outright avoided his gaze. Study groups shifted rooms without telling him. Library seats emptied when he arrived. Professors responded to his questions with clipped formality, then moved on without acknowledgement. It wasn't just that they didn't see him, it was that they refused to. Even custodians, whose greetings had once been casual and warm, now stared at him like he had violated something sacred. Not by speaking out, not by causing trouble, but by daring to look too capable, too sharp, too close to something they had all silently agreed belonged to someone else. Malik didn't talk about it. Not to the faculty, not to administration. He knew how those stories ended. Even if he spoke up, they would label it misunderstanding, miscommunication. A feeling, not a fact. Institutional gaslighting was refined here. Polished to an art, it was more dangerous than open racism, because it left no fingerprints. So, Malik said nothing. He worked. The second layer of Crowley's limit loomed over him like a veil, taunting, just barely out of reach. He had cracked the surface and mapped the first transitions, but the deeper structure was distorted. It wasn't that the logic was broken, it was that it twisted on itself, doubling back in a way that looked purposeful, that bothered him more than anything. As the clock ticked past midnight one Thursday, Malik sat hunched over the small desk in his dorm room, the shadows long and the silence thick. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and even then, he had eaten alone. His eyes burned from hours of focus, but something pulled him forward, a gravitational force behind the numbers. He adjusted one of the core equations, a limit condition that Crowley had emphasized in the lecture, and paused. Something didn't align. The step that followed, which Crowley had framed as a logical necessity, didn't actually hold under alternate convergence parameters. In simpler terms, it was mathematically weak, not wrong, but fragile. And then Malik saw it, a single coefficient that had been anchored to an assumption rather than proof. A small decision, almost invisible, but one that redirected the entire logic of the theorem. And that's when it hit him. The mistake wasn't accidental. The flaw was embedded so cleanly, so strategically, that it would mislead anyone replicating the problem, unless they were resolving it from the ground up. It was like a carefully planted landmine, one that would only detonate if someone dug too deep. Malik's mind reeled, tracing the implications. Crowley had not simply built a hard theorem. He had crafted a deliberate dead end. This wasn't a mathematical misstep. It was sabotage. Malik's pulse quickened, not out of fear but vindication. All those years this theorem had stood untouched, upheld by reputation and tradition. And yet right here, in the quiet of a cold dorm room, he had exposed the first fault line. Not with bravado, not with fanfare, but with focus that came not from privilege, but from having never been allowed to coast. The thought unsettled him, What if the entire theorem was a performance? A gatekeeping device, handed down like folklore to scare off those deemed unworthy? How many students had wasted years chasing its false conclusions? How many had walked away thinking they weren't smart enough, when in truth, the problem had been rigged? He stood up, slowly, stretching limbs gone stiff from hours of stillness. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had closed in with the weight of his discovery. Malik paced once, twice, trying to slow his thoughts, but the implications wouldn't release him. If Crowley had embedded a false logic deliberately, what else had he manipulated? And why? Malik returned to his notes, flipping through the scratched outlines he had made the first week of class. In one corner of his page, he had jotted down Crowley's summary of the theorem, word for word. Now reading it again, it looked less like an academic framework, and more like a carefully written misdirection. This changed everything. It wasn't just about solving the problem anymore. It was about uncovering the motive behind the misdirection. And in doing so, Malik would be challenging more than just a theorem. He would be pulling at the very threads of Crowley's academic legacy. A sharp noise jolted him. Outside his door, footsteps passed, slow, deliberate, almost lingering. He froze, listening. The steps didn't stop. They continued down the corridor, then faded. But something in the way they had moved unsettled him. He turned off the lamp. The darkness returned with a kind of comfort. He wasn't supposed to be making this kind of progress. The system was never built for someone like him to unravel its logic. But he had done it. Quietly. Alone. That made him dangerous. And even though no one had said it aloud, he felt it now more than ever. Crowley's limit wasn't unsolved, because it was impossible. It was unsolved because no one had been allowed to question it. Until now. Malik stared at the new page on his desk. The second layer of the theorem redrawn cleanly, exposed for what it was. A lie told in numbers. A boundary masked as brilliance. The Ivy Tower wasn't just old. It was strategic. It had polished its traditions until they shined too bright to see the cracks beneath. And now one of those cracks had split wide open beneath Crowley's name. Malik picked up his pen again. He didn't need a crowd. He didn't need permission. He only needed the truth. As Malik begins outlining the corrected theorem, he notices something strange. Crowley's original notes include a notation that doesn't exist in any standard mathematical text. It's a mark not meant for academics, but for insiders. And it's not the first time Malik has seen it. The following morning, Malik rose early, driven by the momentum of his late-night discovery. Sleep had barely touched him. The adrenaline of exposing the planted flaw in Crowley's limit still pulsed through his blood. He hadn't just found a miscalculation. He had uncovered a deception. It made everything sharper. The cold air outside, the sound of his boots against the cobblestone paths, the way the buildings around him now felt like relics of a system too proud to admit its own engineered myths. He arrived at the study hall before sunrise, intent on expanding his findings. It was the one room where he could work without surveillance, neutral ground, or so he thought. As he stepped inside, the dim glow of morning light filtered through high windows, throwing long shadows across the wooden tables. Everything looked untouched, silent, still, until he reached his desk. The moment his eyes landed on the surface, he stopped cold. His notebook was gone. Not misplaced, not shifted, completely missing. The careful stack of materials he had left the night before, arranged meticulously and guarded with habitual care, had vanished without a trace. His backup sheets, his separate outline with annotations in the margins, the initial version of the rewritten second layer, all of it gone. Only one thing remained. At the center of the whiteboard he had been using, scrawled in thick black marker, were 3 words. Know your place. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, and purposeful, not angry. Strategic. Whoever wrote it hadn't just wanted to intimidate him. They wanted to erase him. Erase the work. Erase the progress. Erase the idea that he was ever worthy of stepping into territory they considered sacred. Malik didn't move. He let the silence linger, absorbing the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a reminder, an act of academic violence, carefully designed to look like an accident, or at best, an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Malik knew exactly what it was. Stillness gave way to something more powerful than rage. It wasn't new. This feeling had lived with him his entire life, the knowledge that no matter how high he climbed, someone would always be waiting to cut the ladder from beneath him. But now that feeling sharpened into resolve. He cleaned the whiteboard with a single swipe. The message smeared into a gray fog, vanishing like smoke, but the words burned deeper into his memory than ink ever could. Instead of retreating, he opened a new notebook and began again. His mind was clearer now. No distractions, no illusions. Every line he drew came with the full knowledge that he wasn't just solving for variables. He was solving against a culture that refused to see him as capable of anything more than failure. Every number he calculated was now resistance. Every formula rebuilt was a refusal. Still, he couldn't shake the question, who had done it? The study hall required access credentials. It wasn't open to the public. Whoever erased his work had known when he'd be gone, and how to get in. That meant someone inside the academic system, someone trusted, had made that choice. Later that day, Malik quietly reported the theft to a staff member. The response was swift and rehearsed. Apologies were offered. A review would be initiated. Nothing was recorded in writing. No mention of the message was made, though the custodian cleared the board within the hour, as if wiping away the only evidence of wrongdoing could fix the wrong. Malik returned to his dorm and started again. Every hour spent rebuilding came with deeper insights. He had already solved more than any published paper had ever documented, and he was only getting faster. But the more he rebuilt, the more he noticed that other walls were closing in. His academic advisor, Professor Ennis, had once been cordial, if distant. But now, even that pretense slipped. Ennis reviewed Malik's updated draft with an air of concern that felt performative. Rather than commenting on Malik's findings, he raised issues of scope and appropriateness. He said that the problem Malik had chosen might be too ambitious for a first-year student. He suggested Malik consider recalibrating his efforts to focus on more achievable benchmarks. He asked if Malik felt overwhelmed. The implication was not lost on Malik. They didn't want him solving the limit. They didn't even want him trying. The moment he stepped out of the role they had quietly assigned him, that of the grateful token, the hard worker who stayed humble, he became a threat. Word spread fast. Within days, Malik noticed shifts in the way other students spoke of him. Or rather, the way they didn't. Study partners stopped responding to his messages. Group chats went silent. In the dining hall, whispers trailed behind him like echoes from another room. And when he passed certain tables, the phrase affirmative action genius floated into earshot, just loud enough to land, just quiet enough to be denied. None of it was unfamiliar. He had lived with microaggressions since middle school. He had learned how to code switch, how to play polite, how to smile in rooms where the air was laced with judgment. But now the stakes were higher. This wasn't about perception anymore. This was about erasure. And still, he worked. He went back to the theorem each night, this time guarding his work with more caution. He used secondary storage. He encrypted digital copies. He documented every session, and with each layer he rebuilt, he saw more of Crowley's architecture for what it was. Not a mathematical pursuit, but an academic fortress built to keep certain minds out. It made sense then, why Crowley had never presented the problem to white students. Malik had started noticing the pattern. Older students whispered about the limit, but none had ever been directly asked to solve it. Crowley dangled it only in front of those he wanted to humiliate. Those he saw not as protégés but as intrusions. It wasn't about the limit being unsolvable. It was about who was being told to solve it. Then came the twist. At the end of a Friday lecture, just as students began to pack their bags and leave, Crowley stepped forward from behind the podium with an announcement. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard without question. He stated that next week's class would include a live demonstration. A challenge. One that would test mathematical reasoning, in real time. He said they would revisit the infamous Crowley's limit, and one student, would be asked to walk through the theorem's logic on the board. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he looked at Malik. Not a glance. A pointed, sustained stare. The room turned cold. Students turned in their seats, some smirking, others widening their eyes as if a live execution had just been scheduled. The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was a verdict. One that said, "This is it." Malik didn't flinch. He knew what this was. Crowley had set the stage not for inquiry, but for spectacle. He was calling for a public unraveling, a performance of failure. He wasn't just testing knowledge. He was testing boundaries. He wanted to break something in front of everyone, and that something had Malik's name on it. The walls of the room closed in. The students filed out, their steps echoing too loud in a hall too quiet. Whispers followed again, but this time they were laced with anticipation. Malik gathered his things slowly, methodically. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Behind him, on the last row of the auditorium, a student Malik didn't recognize stood and slid a folded note onto his desk before walking out. When Malik opened it, the words inside made his breath catch. Don't trust your advisor. He knew. The morning light poured into the grand auditorium with the harsh indifference of tradition. The stone walls carried the weight of centuries, and the rows of mahogany benches filled faster than any other day that term. There was no pretense of academic eagerness. What pulled the crowd was spectacle. Whispers traveled like wind, weaving through the bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, all converging to watch what they believed would be an academic collapse dressed up as a learning exercise. Malik walked through the side entrance alone. There were no nods, no encouraging glances. Even the usual whispers had hushed, replaced by the tension of watching someone walk toward a cliff edge, unaware of how deep the fall might be. His notebook was tucked beneath his arm, his movements controlled and unreadable, but inside, the air felt heavier, pressed with invisible weight. His heartbeat moved in deliberate, calm rhythms, not because he wasn't nervous, but because he had learned how to move through pressure without letting it shape him. He reached the front row. Crowley stood already near the chalkboard, posture perfect, demeanor casual, as though what was about to unfold were merely a routine intellectual exercise. But everything in the atmosphere betrayed that illusion. Crowley's reputation had been built on this theorem. His presence beside it now wasn't incidental. It was protective. With a slow turn to face the room, Crowley began his introduction. He called the theorem an elegant waste of effort, a phrase he had used before but never with such calculated satisfaction. The crowd responded with muffled amusement, an in-joke for those already resigned to the idea that some things were better left untouched. He explained that today's session would explore the outer edges of conceptual boundaries in mathematical logic, then added, almost as an afterthought, that one student had shown unusual interest in the topic. Every pair of eyes shifted toward Malik. Crowley invited him to the board with a single gesture. Malik stood, expression unreadable, and walked up the steps toward the chalkboard, like a man stepping into weather. He had prepared for all his life. The markers sat in a neat row along the base ledge, new, untouched, symbolic. He picked up the first one, uncapped it, and faced the board. The silence was absolute. The first stroke came slowly, then the next, lines folding into symbols, numbers intersecting with concepts. His movements were clean, each step of logic flowing with deliberate intention. It wasn't just math, it was poetry written in equations, the rhythm born of years spent surviving rooms that had never been designed to hold his voice. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't need to. With each new sequence, Malik peeled back another layer of the theorem, revealing its internal architecture. He skipped the decorative traditions. He went for the bone, and beneath the structure Crowley had wrapped in intellectual vanity, Malik exposed something real, something functional. The room shifted. What started as polite attention turned to unease. A few students leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Others stopped scribbling in their notebooks, and simply watched. Crowley remained still, arms crossed, but his smile had thinned. Not enough to notice, just enough to feel. Malik pressed forward. Each line added was a defiance. Each turn of the marker dared to undo the years of unquestioned dominance that Crowley's limit had imposed. And then, as the room watched, Malik reached a section traditionally treated as impassable. This was where most gave up. The nested parameter condition, an abstracted wall designed to collapse progress. Malik stared at it, mind calculating faster than muscle. Then he did something no one expected. He skipped it, not out of confusion, not by mistake. He bypassed the step entirely, and rewrote the sequence using a compressed vector mapping only hinted at in obscure theoretical frameworks, never before applied to Crowley's limit. The chalk markers snapped faintly in his grip as he underlined the solution. Then it happened. The sound broke through the auditorium, like a crack of thunder, a gasp, not from one, from many. A ripple of disbelief surged through the room, as students leaned forward, mouths parting, eyes widening, not because Malik had made an error, but because he hadn't. He had skipped a step everyone believed necessary, and still landed cleanly in a sub-solution that made sense. Not just sense, brilliance. The math held. Crowley stepped forward subtly. The silence swelled again, but now it was electric. Malik's move had defied the theorem's internal logic without breaking it. He had sidestepped the pitfall and emerged with something the room had never seen. He had made the theorem bend. The implications were immediate. Crowley's limit, long believed to be immovable, had shown a crack. The gasp was not a sound of admiration. It was fear. Fear that someone outside the blueprint had managed to redraw the map. Malik paused, staring at the line he had just written, knowing what it meant. It wasn't arrogance. It was awe. Not at himself, but at the truth. The clarity that he was finally seeing the shape of something that had been hidden in plain sight. Not a flaw in his work, a flaw in the system. He stepped back slightly from the board, marker still in hand, the equation glimmering behind him like a monument. He could hear nothing but his own breathing. The auditorium, those faces, those narrowed eyes, those lips curling at the edge of disbelief, had gone utterly still. Crowley took a step closer. His expression was unreadable, caught between neutrality and containment. And Malik, in that moment, saw something that rewrote the entire game. A flicker of fear. Not panic, not loss of control. Fear of exposure. It was brief, but real. And Malik understood. Crowley hadn't built the limit to be solved. He had built it to be unsolved, especially by someone like Malik. And the more Malik progressed, the more apparent it became that this was not a problem designed to stretch minds. It was a problem designed to separate them. Not just a gate, but a mirror. The academic world had used Crowley's limit to define greatness by exclusion. Malik was unearthing the buried truth, that the limit was never about knowledge. It was about preservation, power, illusion. The sub-solution Malik had just reached, clean, undeniable, was the first public fracture. He felt the audience behind him. They were no longer curious. They were bracing, because if Malik could skip a step and still be correct, then maybe the steps themselves weren't sacred. Maybe they had just been repeated too long to question. He turned back to the board, hand tightening slightly. He wasn't finished. Not yet. But the room no longer belonged to Crowley. It belonged to the question, now thundering in everyone's mind. What if the problem was never unsolvable? Just never meant to be solved by him? As Malik reaches for the second marker to continue, a loud voice echoes from the back of the hall, interrupted not by a professor, but by a senior faculty member rarely seen in lecture halls, declaring that the demonstration must stop, citing unauthorized academic exposure of protected intellectual property. The silence that swallowed the lecture hall was not reverence. It was denial struggling to keep its mask on. Malik stood at the board, the chalk snapping between his fingers from the weight of his grip. The broken tip skittered across the tray, as the jagged mark he had just drawn finished the final condition of the second logic band. The sound echoed like a crack in stained glass, but no one moved. The theorem Crowley's limit had just been shifted, not dismantled, not bypassed, but restructured in a way no academic had ever dared. And the person doing it wasn't a decorated researcher or tenured authority. It was a 17-year-old black student from the Bronx, standing alone against a theorem designed to humiliate rather than enlighten. Malik didn't step away. He let the unfinished proof breathe on the board like a rising tide. He hadn't solved everything yet, but what he had done was impossible, by Cambridge standards. Not because of the math, because of who he was while doing it. The room wasn't ready. Every eye was trained on him, but not one mouth opened. Some students leaned back in their seats as if distancing themselves from the discomfort of watching someone tear down a monument they had never questioned. Others stared at the floor, unsure if acknowledging Malik's work would make them complicit in something forbidden. They weren't watching a breakthrough. They were witnessing a disruption. Crowley didn't speak, not at first. His arms remained crossed, his expression stony, carved in ivory detachment. But the tightness in his jaw betrayed more than skepticism. This wasn't just an academic issue. The proof Malik was writing wasn't just advancing knowledge. It was undoing authority. Every line on the board rewrote a hierarchy that Crowley had personally curated. For decades, the limit had stood as a barrier, a way to signal who didn't belong. It wasn't a problem designed to stretch genius. It was a wall built to keep genius contained. And now, in front of a packed room, that wall had cracked. Malik shifted his grip to a new piece of chalk and continued writing. His pace was steady, deliberate. The logic flowed in fluid strokes, line after line, forming a pathway deeper into the theorem's core. He wasn't showing off. There was no ego here. This was survival in mathematical form, a quiet rebellion in chalk. and silence. Every time he moved forward, the air grew heavier. What had begun as a setup had turned into a reckoning. Students had come expecting to witness failure, perhaps a lesson in hubris. What they were seeing instead was the unveiling of a truth they weren't prepared to acknowledge. The system wasn't built for fairness. It was built for repetition, and Malik had disrupted the pattern. Crowley finally stepped forward. The sound of his shoes against the stone floor was a disruption in itself. Each step brought him closer to the board, to the proof that now mocked his legacy with silent precision. His eyes moved along the fresh equations, studying them not as a professor validating a student's work, but as a man watching his constructed mythology collapse. He stopped just behind Malik, his presence close but suffocating. Malik knew he was there, but he didn't turn. He kept writing. That's when it happened. Crowley's voice cut through the tension with a cold edge. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. His words were clipped, final, and unmistakably personal. He said it was over. Not the lecture, not the exercise. Malik's entire demonstration. The room didn't breathe. Malik's hand froze midair. The chalk hovered just above the next symbol, a step he had already calculated, already confirmed. But now it sat suspended, as if a boundary had been physically redrawn in front of him. Crowley had just declared the moment null. His statement wasn't framed as academic critique. It was dismissal, a gavel masked as guidance. He hadn't questioned Malik's logic. He had erased Malik's right to finish it. Malik slowly lowered the chalk to the tray. His back remained straight. He didn't step down. He didn't argue. He didn't respond. The only reaction he gave was silence. A silence so dense it made Crowley's assertion feel hollow. The room remained frozen. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing the enforcement of protocol or the performance of power. No one spoke in Malik's defense. No one objected, because to do so would mean acknowledging what had really happened. That this wasn't about mathematics. It was about control. Crowley turned to the students and casually redirected the class back to theory, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. His tone was measured, his words smoothly academic, but his posture betrayed him. Shoulders stiff, spine overly straight. He had won the battle of appearances, but only just. Malik stood there, unmoving. He looked at the board, now half filled with a proof he knew could go further. He knew what came next. Every step was clear in his mind, as precise and powerful as the lines he had already drawn. But they would not be seen. Not today. He turned slowly, markerless now, and walked back to his seat. The path back to his row felt longer than the one to the front. The eyes that watched him were different now. No longer laughing, no longer certain. They weren't hostile anymore. They were afraid that the hierarchy they relied on might not be as solid as they believed. When he sat, he didn't slouch. He didn't sigh. He simply folded his hands, eyes locked forward. Across the room, a student with gold-rimmed glasses glanced at Malik's incomplete proof with something close to wonder, but said nothing. No one said anything. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was loud with tension, charged with the knowledge that something irreversible had just occurred. Crowley returned to the podium and spoke of boundaries in mathematics, of limits and fallacies, of illusions and truths. His lecture floated through the room like incense masking smoke. But his words no longer carried the same weight. Something had changed. Malik had shown them something undeniable, and that frightened them more than anything. He didn't need applause. He didn't need acknowledgement. He had never come to be celebrated. He came to expose what had been carefully hidden. But as the lecture came to an end, as students filed out with unease still clinging to their faces, Malik felt the shift again, the invisible machinery of the institution realigning itself. They would not let this go unpunished. Not directly, but incrementally, systematically. He was no longer just a student. He was now a problem. And the system had always been designed to eliminate problems. As the last student exited the hall, Malik rose quietly. The board still bore the unfinished proof, a map to something greater that now hung in limbo. He looked at it one final time, then turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he noticed something. On the ground, near the lectern, half hidden beneath the podium base, was a folder. It had a familiar color, university stamped, stiff-backed, the kind used for faculty research. He bent slightly and slid it out. The label read, Crowley's Limit, Internal Review Draft, 2003. His eyes widened. This wasn't supposed to be here. And when he opened it, just enough to see the contents, He froze. Inside was a draft of the same theorem, but it was different. Marked through in red ink. Corrected. Notations matching the very steps Malik had just written on the board. Malik turned the final page of the forgotten folder and saw something that made his stomach drop. Crowley's own initials beside an equation he had told the world was impossible. The folder weighed heavy in Malik's hands as he returned to his dorm, its crisp edges cold against his skin. Every step echoed louder than usual, like the very ground beneath Cambridge had shifted. Because it had, the contents of that folder weren't just evidence, they were revelation. The notations mirrored Malik's solution too precisely to be coincident. Red ink corrections, dated 2003, bore Crowley's own initials beside reworked lines that aligned almost identically with Malik's proof. It wasn't just that Crowley had once solved his own unsolvable theorem. It was that he had buried the solution, then built a legacy around its impossibility. The truth was undeniable now. But by the time Malik placed the folder gently on his desk, careful not to crease a single page, the knock came. 3 slow raps. Then silent. He opened the door to find a white envelope on the floor. No return address. Just a seal bearing the university crest. Inside, a single sheet. Academic misconduct review. Urgent. Attendance required. The session was scheduled for the next morning. No explanation. No details. No accusation written in plain ink. But the message was clear. By the time Malik arrived at the administrative building the next day, the gears had already turned. He wasn't greeted. He wasn't offered water. He was escorted. 3 steps behind a student officer whose back never turned, down sterile hallways, into a small room where a panel of professors sat beneath framed portraits of Cambridge's greatest minds, none of them black, none of them blinking. Crowley wasn't present. He didn't need to be. His fingerprints were everywhere. The chair of the review committee, Professor Hargrave, spoke in a voice too smooth to be casual. He said there had been concerns about the originality of Malik's demonstration. Questions raised about the integrity of his process. Rumors unsubstantiated but troubling suggested Malik might have had outside assistance, or worse, copied research from previously unpublished work. The irony almost made Malik laugh. Instead, he sat straight, his hands folded, his silence a shield. They asked him to walk through his methodology, not out of curiosity, but as a trap. Every answer he gave was met with another raised eyebrow, another exchange of glances. They didn't want clarity. They wanted guilt. The review lasted 45 minutes. By the time it ended, Malik's coursework had been placed on hold. All submissions would be temporarily frozen pending further investigation. His library access would be limited. His scholarship, already subject to renewal reviews, was now in jeopardy. No formal charges had been filed, but in practice he was already guilty. That night, Malik sat in his room, surrounded by his own notes, the folder from Crowley still unopened on the floor beside him. The silence outside felt like surveillance. He stared at the ceiling, replaying every step he'd taken since arriving on campus, every correct answer that was met with suspicion, every quiet erasure that followed his success. He knew what was happening now. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about removing him. The backlash moved quickly, but not loudly. There were no angry mobs, no explicit language, just the institutional elegance of targeted erasure, disguised as process. In the following days, whispers resurfaced, more venomous than before. Malik's inbox filled with unreadable noise. Anonymous messages accusing him of gaming the system, mocking his background, suggesting that his ghetto genius wouldn't survive scrutiny. Someone photoshopped a flyer of him with the words "diversity trickster" and left it in the faculty mailroom. And yet he said nothing. Because that's how they won, by baiting outrage. His peers, the same ones who had watched his proof in stunned silence, now avoided eye contact altogether. Some pretended not to recognize him. Others had the decency to at least look uncomfortable. But no one asked questions. No one reached out. Only one change in the system betrayed the truth. An internal report circulated, quietly, declaring that Crowley's limit would no longer be used as a lecture model due to concerns over its structural integrity. No attribution, no acknowledgement, just quiet deletion. Even the board had begun to fold in on itself. But instead of crediting Malik, they erased both him and the problem. One move, 2 solutions. Then came the final blow. An automated message hit his student portal. His financial aid had been flagged. Status under review. The words meant one thing: risk of revocation. Suddenly, The future he had clawed his way toward, the world he had rebuilt his life around, hung by a thread. What made it worse was who remained untouched. A group of white students, sons of alumni, Legacy admits, had recently been caught copying entire assignments from paid online tutors. The incident had gone around privately for weeks. Everyone knew, and yet none of them were summoned for review. No suspensions, no threats to their funding. Just Malik, because his offense wasn't cheating. It was competence. He hadn't broken the rules. He had broken the illusion that the rules were applied equally. That night, he sat staring at the folder again. He knew what was inside could vindicate him. He had scanned every page. The draft not only confirmed the solvability of the theorem, it mirrored his approach. Crowley had not only known the solution existed, he had preemptively buried it. And now, Malik had unearthed the academic equivalent of a sealed crime scene. But if he used it, if he made it public, the attack would escalate. It would become legal, structural, character-based. They'd go after more than his scholarship. They'd go after his credibility. He turned away from the desk and crossed the room, every muscle tired. Not from the math, from the politics of survival. He knew the next move wasn't about proof anymore. It was about strategy. The next morning, as he stepped outside for the first time in days, Malik noticed a shadow near his dorm's mailbox cluster, just a figure walking away slowly. Hood up, backpack slung low. He approached cautiously. Inside his box was a small note, folded once. No envelope. No signature. He opened it. The handwriting was tight and slanted, rushed but legible. "We know you're right, but don't push it." No threat, no encouragement, just a warning wrapped in confirmation. And Malik felt it. He wasn't just dealing with academic gatekeeping anymore. He was walking straight into a war. That night, Malik receives an encrypted email from an address he doesn't recognize. Attached is a scanned page, Crowley's original draft, but this time, with handwritten annotations by another name. A name Malik had never seen, but one that had been crossed out and replaced by Crowley's. Malik stared at the scanned image on his screen for a long time. The handwriting was unmistakably different from Crowley's. Sharper, more fluid, but one name had been neatly scratched out at the bottom. Beneath that erased signature, Crowley's name had been penned in. It was a quiet theft carried out in red ink and arrogance, and it rewrote everything Malik thought he knew about the theorem's history. It meant that Crowley didn't just bury the solution. He stole it. The implications stretched beyond humiliation. They bordered on academic fraud, intellectual theft, and institutional complicity, if others had known and remained silent. Malik knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. The folder, the email, the erased name, it was too much to carry alone. But the system had shown its hand. It would not protect him. The university had made that clear when it moved to suspend his coursework without a hearing. If he was going to fight this, he needed eyes behind walls. People who could slip through the cracks where formal justice wouldn't go. What he needed was a network. And unexpectedly it found him first, later that week, in a quiet corner of the library where old manuscripts lined the walls like relics of a forgotten empire. Malik felt someone slide into the seat across from him. He looked up to see Dr. Elise Gardner, a visiting lecturer from the States, known mostly for her quiet lectures in marginalized learning theory and post-colonial data bias. She didn't offer greetings. She placed a slim envelope on the table and slid it toward him without a word. Malik hesitated, then opened it. Inside were copies of past evaluations and grade reports from students, specifically black students, who had failed or mysteriously withdrawn after enrolling in Crowley's advanced courses. There were patterns, documented declines in grades after strong starts, comments written in the margins of essays dismissing brilliance as unrefined, rushed, or technically flawed despite potential. And in 3 cases, official reports of academic disengagement filed days before those students left the program entirely. Elise leaned in slightly. Her voice was low, measured, but brimming with long-held tension. She explained that she had spent years watching talented students disappear, their spirits broken not by the rigor of the material, but by the weight of silent sabotage. She had seen Crowley's tactics before, how he'd call on students only to belittle them, how he'd change grading rubrics mid-term, how he'd praise mediocrity in those who resembled himself while erasing the exceptional in those who didn't. No one challenged him, because challenging Crowley meant risking career death. But Elise had nothing left to lose. Her contract hadn't been renewed. She was leaving the university in a matter of weeks. That made her dangerous in all the right ways. Malik and Elise began to meet quietly, at odd hours, and in obscure corners of campus. She brought more files, emails between faculty, archived internal memos, even notes from old staff meetings, where Crowley had pushed for the exclusion of certain mathematical approaches he deemed outside academic standard. What he really meant, Elise explained, was outside whiteness. Malik worked in silence during these meetings, absorbing every document, every memo, cataloging every pattern. The systemic rot was deeper than he imagined. Crowley wasn't just a bad actor. He was the architect of a structure built to look neutral, while operating with surgical discrimination. But Malik wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. Word began to spread. Not loudly, not publicly, but through quiet acknowledgments, shared glances, hesitant knocks on his door. A second-year student from Ghana left a printed article under his doorframe, highlighting academic gatekeeping in British institutions. An anonymous email arrived from a grad student, claiming Crowley had pressured them to drop a thesis that mirrored Malik's line of reasoning 5 years ago. The whispers turned into threads, and the threads began to weave a network. They called it the Whisper Network, mostly composed of students of color, first-generation scholars, adjunct lecturers, and marginalized staff. It wasn't a formal alliance. It was survival turned into strategy. Every person had their own scar, their own story of being muted, redirected, erased. But now, for the first time, those silences were forming a chorus. One student passed Malik a flash drive in the hallway without a word. Inside were audio recordings of Crowley speaking candidly in private meetings, referring to students from non-traditional backgrounds as distractions to serious theory. Another staff member slipped a copy of an old internal review that raised questions about Crowley's use of research assistants, only for it to be buried by administrative intervention. Elise was the linchpin. She had once served as Crowley's temporary assistant during her postdoc years. She knew where the files were kept, what passwords he used, how his office was organized. It wasn't just about what he had hidden. It was about what he believed no one would ever find. And then came the break. Late one night, Elise messaged Malik to meet her in the archival wing, one of the oldest buildings on campus. He arrived to find her standing over a stack of boxes, one already open, files strewn across the table. She looked shaken but focused. Inside the box were lecture notes and draft articles, including early versions of Crowley's most famous publications. Among them, tucked inside a folder labeled Private Do Not Circulate, was a single file with no formal heading. It was handwritten, dated. The title read, Crowley's True Limit. Draft redacted. Malik's heart pounded. He flipped through the pages. The handwriting was unmistakably Crowley's, but this version of the theorem looked strikingly familiar, not because he had seen it before, but because it was his. Line by line, the equations mirrored Malik's own approach, not precisely, but thematically. The structure, the logic, the breakthrough points, they aligned with terrifying accuracy. But what chilled him wasn't the similarity. It was the final page. There in Crowley's own notes, he had written a margin comment, too clean. If discovered, problem loses legacy, solution must be buried. Rework framing, add abstraction layers, use Harlem case as stress test. Harlem. Crowley had been testing this on black students for years. Malik stepped back, breath knocked from his lungs. Elise stood silently beside him, her face hardening as the weight of the page settled between them. It was never about Malik solving the limit. It was about making sure he didn't. The entire structure had been a trap, not to protect theory, but to protect Crowley's throne, and the institution had enabled it, because Crowley's myth served them all. Now that myth was bleeding, and Malik held the knife. Elise pulled another folder from the box, this one sealed and marked confidential legal review. Inside was a list of names, former students, flagged by Crowley over the years, every one of them black, and at the bottom was a name Malik had never seen before, until he opened the attachment from that anonymous email the week prior. It was the original author of the erased proof, and they were still alive. The name in the folder echoed like a distant memory, yet Malik had never heard it spoken aloud. Dr. Langston Rayner. It was typed cleanly at the bottom of the page, buried beneath red stamps and crossed-out approvals. Rayner, it turned out, had been a doctoral candidate at Cambridge in the early 2000s, brilliant, unassuming, and quietly black. His thesis had centered on the very logic Crowley would later parade as his crowning legacy. And somewhere between draft reviews and final submissions, Rayner had disappeared, not from the world, but from the institution's history. His work had been quietly absorbed, his name quietly erased. And now, decades later, Malik had unintentionally resurrected the ghost Crawley had spent his career trying to bury. But ghosts didn't stay buried for long, especially when the living started digging. Malik and Elise began to catalog every file they had uncovered, scanning each page with care, backing up documents on encrypted drives, and moving physical evidence to off-campus storage. They knew what they held wasn't just proof, it was danger. It was the kind of truth that cracked reputations, not theories. By the following week, Elise noticed the first sign of digital intrusion. Her university login failed without warning. At first, she thought it was a technical glitch. Then, her email locked her out completely. 2 hours later, the internal archive she used for research flagged her access as restricted pending investigation. Malik's account followed. When he tried to upload a scanned draft of Crawley's redacted notes to a private drive, the upload failed, and then the entire folder disappeared from his hard drive. Auto backups were wiped. The cloud mirror showed 0 files. When he checked the local recovery bin, it was already clear. They weren't just being watched now. They were being erased in real time. Then came the strange movements. At first it was subtle. Someone standing too long outside the lecture hall. After his classes, someone following a few steps too close down the library corridor. He'd catch a glimpse of a face, then lose it. One evening, as Malik stepped off the bus 2 blocks from his dorm, a black sedan slowed beside him, before turning off its headlights. No plate. No driver he could identify. It drove away the second he pulled out his phone. He stopped sleeping properly after that. Meanwhile, the university remained publicly quiet. But behind closed doors, Crawley had already begun his counteroffensive. Elise discovered a forum thread in an academic research network titled Questionable Logic and Unverified Claims in Undergraduate Mathematics. Though the post was anonymous, the language was unmistakably Crawley's. The post claimed that Malik had been influenced by external non-academic theories and accused him of seeking notoriety through digital manipulation. Without naming him directly, the insinuation was clear. It called into question the source of his discoveries, implying they had been lifted from historical drafts found online, ironically referencing the very documents Crawley had stolen in the first place. The response was predictable. Some commenters rushed to Crawley's defense, praising his legacy and questioning why unproven claims were being weaponized. Others, more cautious, asked for facts but were drowned out. One message simply read, "Another race-baiting genius looking for attention. Don't fall for it." The mask was off. Institutional racism was no longer passive. It was active. It didn't wear a robe. It wore credentials. It didn't burn crosses. It redlined email servers and rewrote narratives in real time. And still, Malik pressed forward. He reached out to students from the Whisper Network, organizing a private meeting in the lower levels of the old student center, far from faculty eyes. There he laid out everything: the proof, the redacted draft, the original author's name. Elise stood beside him, her eyes tired, but resolute. Most sat in silence, but not in disbelief. They had all seen parts of the system eat their ambitions. Now they saw the full machine. A second-year med student from Nigeria volunteered to help encrypt the files properly and mirror them to international drives. Another student in journalism connected Malik with a quiet contact in academic media who specialized in exposing hidden scandals. The Whisper Network had become something larger, no longer whispers, but plans. That's when the system struck back. Elise arrived on campus one morning to find her office door sealed and her email deactivated. A notice taped to the door cited ongoing investigation into policy violations and breach of faculty boundaries. The wording was vague, but precise enough to signal that her time at Cambridge was over. No hearing, no explanation, just a locked door and a warning. Her ID was stripped, her access revoked. The day she left campus, she didn't cry. She hugged Malik briefly and handed him a flash drive, eyes fierce. Inside were emails, ones she had managed to pull before being locked out. Correspondences between Crawley and senior administrators, referencing Malik without naming him, calling him a problematic anomaly, and warning that unchecked ambition will dismantle hard-earned reputations. In one email, Crawley wrote, "He doesn't just threaten the limit, he threatens the system that sustains it." That same night, Malik received another notice, slipped under his dorm door unsigned. It was his final warning. Withdraw or face formal expulsion. Deadline 72 hours. No hearing, no appeal, no second chance. He stared at the paper, fingers trembling, not with fear but with fury. He wasn't just being pushed out, he was being deleted. Just like Dr. Langston Rayner. Just like the students in the folder. Just like every person who had ever gotten too close to the truth and refused to play small. He looked around his room, his books, his notes, the half-burned lamp still flickering by his bedside, and realized what was at stake. It wasn't just his place at Cambridge. It was the narrative. If he left quietly, the story would be rewritten without him. They'd say he plagiarized, that he cracked under pressure, that he made it all up. He'd become another cautionary tale whispered in faculty lounges. Brilliant, but unstable. But if he stayed, they'd come harder. Still, something deeper had changed inside him. He no longer feared losing access to the institution. He feared letting the institution win. The next day, he walked into the mathematics building not as a student, but as a disruption. He moved past the portraits, the glass plaques, the long hallways, lined with legacies he was never meant to join. He went straight to the faculty archives, past students, past staff, and straight to the librarian, who once refused him access. This time she looked up, startled, but didn't speak. He slid the flash drive across the counter, eyes steady, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The evidence would speak for itself now. That night, as Malik returned to his dorm, he found a small package on his desk. No return address. Inside was an old thesis, yellowed by time, bound in soft black leather. The author, Dr. Langston Rayner, and scribbled inside the front cover, in fresh blue ink, was a handwritten note. They erased me. Don't let them do it to you. The moment Malik held Langston Rayner's original thesis in his hands, something irreversible shifted. The black leather binding felt warm, lived in, like it had been waiting for years to be opened by someone who would actually see. Inside, Rayner's ideas were brilliant, radical, and unmistakably ahead of their time. His equations mirrored Malik's proof, almost step for step, not because Malik had copied them, but because truth, when unburdened by fear, finds similar paths. The hand-scrawled message inside was short but electric. They erased me. Don't let them do it to you. The sentence repeated in Malik's mind for hours, pulsing like a countdown. That night, he made the decision. He wouldn't go quietly. He wouldn't wait for a committee to weaponize process against him. He wouldn't give the university the satisfaction of framing his withdrawal as academic failure. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to do it in full view of the world. He stayed up until 4 a.m., alone in his dorm, door locked, lines drawn. He gathered everything. The redacted Crawley draft with margin notes about Harlem stress tests, the scans of Langston Rayner's thesis, the university emails Elise had smuggled out before her suspension, and the video from the lecture. The moment where he skipped the sacred step and the room gasped. He stitched them together. No commentary, no music, just the truth in sequence. The last slide was a single statement in white font on a black screen. You told me I didn't belong. Then you tried to erase me. But math doesn't lie. The video went live anonymously at 6:12 a.m. GMT. By 7:04 it had 238 views. By noon, it crossed 40,000. By midnight it surpassed 1 million. The explosion was fast, uncontainable, and entirely outside the university's control. Twitter ignited first. The hashtag Malik was right climbed from niche academic circles to global trends. Screenshots of the lecture board circulated with breathless commentary. Black scholars reposted the video with captions like, "This is what institutional erasure looks like in real time." Former Cambridge students began quote tweeting with veiled references to Crowley, some admitting they too had mysteriously failed his classes after attempting ambitious theses. Then came the articles. Academic bloggers picked it up. Then student-led news outlets. Within 36 hours, major international publications began running pieces with headlines like, "Cambridge's crowning shame, racism, plagiarism, and the collapse of a mathematical myth, Crowley's limit or Rayner's legacy. A stolen proof reawakens an erased scholar." When a teen from the Bronx proved a lie, the story of Malik Jensen, the university issued its first statement, late into the second day. Cold, defensive, vague. It referred to the matter as an internal academic disagreement, being misrepresented online. It called the leaked documents unauthorized, and warned the public not to draw conclusions based on unverified digital material. Crowley issued a separate statement through a private PR firm. He called it a misunderstanding. He claimed the redacted draft was a speculative exercise, never meant to be considered formal work. He referred to Rayner only as a former student who didn't complete his program. And of Malik, he said, "I support diversity of thought, but excellence requires rigor, not online outrage." That sentence became a meme within hours. Someone photoshopped it over an image of Malik standing at the chalkboard with the equation behind him, and Crowley's smug face blurred in the background. The caption underneath read, "Excellence requires erasure. Cambridge." Within 72 hours, the pressure mounted. News anchors discussed Malik's story on morning television. Talk shows brought in black academics who told stories of being sabotaged by white gatekeepers in elite spaces. A thread comparing Cambridge's public handling of plagiarism allegations against black students versus white legacy students went viral. Alumni began contacting the university directly. Some rescinded donations, others demanded resignations. And quietly, more stories emerged. A former graduate student from 2007 anonymously shared that their work had been stalled after Crowley discouraged their advisor from supporting it. A faculty member still at Cambridge leaked a memo suggesting Crowley had intervened to block another black student's research grant. Malik, meanwhile, said nothing. He didn't post. He didn't comment. He let the silence protect him while the storm grew. But the institution wasn't done fighting. By the 5th day, Malik received a summons, not to a hearing, but to a university wellness check. The message framed it as concern for his emotional well-being following unexpected online attention. The wording was manipulative. It wasn't concern. It was an opening. He declined the meeting. 2 hours later, his student email was deactivated again. But by then, it didn't matter. His story had transcended the system trying to cage it. That same night, while scanning news headlines on his phone, a new email popped up from an address ending in "I." The subject line was just one word. "Ready?" He opened it. Inside, a brief message. No pleasantries. No fluff. Just a line that hit harder than any threat. "They'll come for you harder now. Be ready." It was signed by a name he recognized. Dr. Octavia Blythe, a professor of theoretical mathematics at MIT, the first black woman ever to hold that chair, known for dismantling academic elitism in peer-reviewed publishing. And according to her bio, one of Langston Rayner's final thesis reviewers, before he vanished from Cambridge's records. Malik leaned back, the glow of the screen lighting his face. This wasn't over. This was just the opening act. The next morning, a new message hit the inbox Malik had set up for tips. The subject line read, "Crowley didn't work alone," attached a scanned internal memo from 2006, signed by 4 senior Cambridge board members, greenlighting the redaction of Rayner's thesis for reputation management. The leaked memo changed everything. What had begun as a viral academic scandal suddenly became something darker. Something older. Malik stared at the scanned document, its header bearing the Cambridge crest, its language polished and vague, yet brutally clear in intent. In light of potential disruption to institutional reputation, the recommendation is to redact Mr. Rayner's work and preserve the existing framework of the limit under Dr. Crowley's authority. 4 signatures sat at the bottom. 4 senior board members whose names were still listed on current university directories. This wasn't just Crowley's doing. This was sanctioned. And now Malik understood why the system wasn't collapsing. It was defending itself. Not against error, but exposure. The backlash came quickly, but not in the direction many expected. Instead of launching an inquiry into Crowley's actions, Cambridge initiated a full academic audit on Malik. The pretense was standard. Verification of all credentials and submissions to ensure integrity. In truth, it was retaliation. He was asked to submit all past work for review. Every assignment, every test. His high school transcripts were requested again. SAT and ACT scores, competition results, recommendation letters. Even personal essays, as if the proof of his brilliance now required re-authentication simply because he'd embarrassed the wrong man. The message was clear. You've gone too far. And it didn't stop there. Within days, Malik's scholarship was flagged, then paused, then revoked. No explanation beyond a cold administrative email, stating that funding is contingent upon compliance with institutional integrity standards. No appeal process, no advisor contact, no human voice, just silence. His university ID lost access to lecture halls, then libraries, then the campus Wi-Fi. He hadn't been expelled, but the institution had ghosted him. Outside, the media war was intensifying. News networks that had praised Malik's proof now started pivoting. Think pieces began to surface, questioning his methods. Some writers, clearly parroting internal talking points, labeled him a brilliant but volatile outlier. Others went further, calling him dangerous, obsessed, fixated on takedown instead of truth. A British tabloid ran a headline that read, "From math prodigy to conspiracy pawn, inside the rise and fall of Malik Jensen." In TV panel shows, pundits debated whether viral fame had gotten to his head. One called him the Kanye of calculus. Another wondered aloud if his urban background made it hard for him to handle pressure. No one mentioned Rayner. No one mentioned the memo. But behind the curtain, pressure was building. Alumni began quietly withdrawing donations. A prominent black graduate publicly announced she would no longer fund the annual scholarship program, bearing her name. An online petition demanding an independent review of Crowley's tenure reached 300,000 signatures in 5 days. Students held vigils outside the math department, carrying signs that read, "Math doesn't erase," and Rayner walked so Malik could run. Still, the administration didn't budge. Because institutions don't concede, they reframe. The strategy shifted again. A new article surfaced, one that sent cold electricity through Malik's body. Published in an academic psychology journal, the piece explored cases of stress-induced delusion in highly gifted adolescents from underrepresented backgrounds. The article didn't name Malik, but the references were impossible to miss. One case study centered around a young male prodigy who developed conspiracy frameworks involving faculty theft after rapid academic success, citing behavioral markers like sleep deprivation, social withdrawal, and paranoid tendencies. Elise messaged Malik an hour later. She had already traced the co-author, a psychiatrist on retainer for Cambridge, Crowley's retainer, and the final twist came days later. An anonymous forum post, this time from a Cambridge-associated subreddit, leaked what it claimed was a private psychiatric evaluation conducted on Malik by student services early in his term. The PDF, fake but eerily professional, alleged emotional volatility, grandiosity under pressure, and tendencies toward persecutory thinking. The watermark read, "Confidential internal assessment, not for external use." But now it was everywhere. The university didn't confirm it, but they didn't deny it either. Crowley released a short statement within 24 hours of the leak. "While I cannot speak to private evaluations, I urge all parties to treat this young man with compassion. It is deeply saddening to watch promise become paranoia." The trap was complete. Malik wasn't just being framed as dishonest. He was being framed as unstable. In academic spaces, there are few things more fatal than the stigma of mental unfitness, especially for a black student in elite circles. It rewrites every achievement into coincidence, every failure into prophecy. It strips agency. It rewrites the body into a threat. Malik sat alone in his dorm, the light from his desk lamp flickering across the folders he'd once believed would bring justice. Now they felt like tombstones. For Rayner, for Elise's career, for the version of himself that thought truth alone would be enough. And yet something had changed. This wasn't the same Malik who had walked into Cambridge hoping to impress anyone. This was a Malik who understood that when you threaten power, it doesn't fight fair, it fights to erase. But he also knew something else. They were running out of cover. Because people were still watching. Because the files were still out. Because the proof still stood. His inbox, despite everything, was full of messages from students around the world. Teenagers sending screenshots of their own math work. A professor from Brazil offering remote collaboration. A mother in Detroit thanking him for showing her son what resistance looked like. The internet didn't forget, and neither would he. Malik stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop. He opened a new document, not a response, not a defense, a manifesto, not for academia, for history. Just as he began typing, a new email arrived from a restricted Cambridge server. The subject line read, "Faculty records leak, urgent." Attached was a single image Crowley's signed contract from 2004, listing one condition of his appointment: tenure protection contingent on exclusivity of Crowley's limit. The leaked condition from Crowley's 2004 contract tore through academic circles like a lightning strike. Tenure protection contingent on the exclusivity of his limit. an agreement that effectively made the theorem not just a mathematical claim, but a financial one. Crawley had tied his reputation, his career security, even his authority at Cambridge to a single idea that his theorem was untouchable, revered, and unsolved, and anyone who challenged it wasn't just questioning the proof, they were threatening the foundation of his power. Once that realization spread, the psychiatric smear suddenly looked less like concern and more like desperation. The academic community reacted faster than the administration expected. It started with a single essay published by a black professor at Howard University, titled Madness as a Weapon: The Colonial History of Academic Gaslighting. She drew connections between Malik's situation and a long lineage of scholars of color who had been labeled unstable, emotional, or intellectually dangerous whenever they came too close to truths the establishment wasn't ready to face. The essay was shared thousands of times within hours. Then came a wave of responses from scholars across the world: mathematicians, sociologists, historians, even mental health advocates, calling out Cambridge's pattern with chilling precision. They compiled historical examples, prodigies dismissed as delusional, innovative theories discredited by whiteness, masquerading as rigor, talented black students driven out of institutions under the guise of well-being concerns. Malik, still sitting at the small desk in his dorm room, watched the backlash unfold in real time. The university had spent decades perfecting the art of quiet erasure. Now that subtle machinery was being dissected publicly, its cogs exposed. But with the exposure came something else. A shift. A slow, undeniable change in how people talked about Malik.
What had started as a scandal became a case study. Students in Chicago uploaded videos discussing the racist tactics institutions used against black prodigies. Teachers in Atlanta assigned Malik's leaked files as reading material. Classrooms in Detroit held roundtable discussions comparing Rayner's disappearance with Malik's weaponized evaluation. His experience became a lesson, an indictment of the system, and an inspiration for the students it had long tried to suffocate.
Malik didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want pity or martyrdom. He wanted justice. And justice required more than trending hashtags or sympathetic essays. It required accountability. For Crawley, for the board members, for the institution that had spent years masking intellectual theft beneath polished tradition. Malik understood that the war he was fighting no longer lived only in classrooms or viral threads. It needed a battlefield with consequences, a space where evidence mattered as much as narrative, the legal arena. The idea frightened him, not because he feared losing, but because he recognized what entering that space would mean. Institutions fight hardest when cornered. Cambridge would not surrender quietly. They would twist his intentions, weaponize his background, and exploit every crack in his story. But the alternative, silence, was no longer an option. To walk away now would be to accept Rayner's fate, to confirm the university's belief that erasure was inevitable. So Malik began preparing. He organized every file, labeling each in chronological order. Every draft Crawley had redacted, every internal memo Elise discovered, every anonymous tip, every archival scan. He turned his dorm into a command center of truth. The stacks of paper were not chaos, they were clarity. Still, as he organized the evidence, a heaviness crept into his chest. This was bigger than him. It was bigger than Rayner. It was the weight of hundreds of erased stories, compressed into a single moment, with no guarantee of victory. Then the backlash reached a new height. A Cambridge-affiliated psychologist wrote a scathing commentary claiming that Malik's supporters were romanticizing his instability. The article insisted that the public was misguidedly elevating a troubled student to the status of civil rights icon. It accused Malik of manipulating vulnerable communities, of exploiting the narrative of racial injustice for personal fame. The article spread like wildfire across certain corners of the internet, places where racism hid behind intellectual superiority and coded language. Anonymous commenters rushed in, calling Malik unfit, volatile, dangerous. They didn't know him, but they recognized the pattern. When institutions wanted to destroy a black mind, they didn't attack intelligence. They attacked sanity. But this time, the tactic backfired spectacularly. Black psychologists, therapists, and clinicians erupted online. They wrote threads, essays, and videos explaining the historical weaponization of mental health against black brilliance. They compared Crawley's strategy to colonial practices, where enslaved people were diagnosed as insane for resisting oppression. They invoked the stories of black activists, institutionalized for questioning power. What Cambridge tried to use as a scalpel became a boomerang. Malik felt the shift like heat rising. Support poured in from unexpected corners. Retired mathematicians, speaking softly in recorded statements. Community leaders hosting teach-ins. Diaspora scholars, tracing Rayner's erased legacy across continents. The story had escaped Cambridge's control. But viral support wasn't justice. And Malik couldn't mistake attention for action. He returned to Rayner's thesis again. Read the pages slowly this time. Absorbing every equation, every margin note, every intellectual breadcrumb. Someone had silenced Rayner. Someone had transformed his brilliance into Crowley's currency. Malik could almost feel him in the equations. Mathematics didn't erase fingerprints. The past wasn't gone. It was repeating. It was screaming. And Malik finally understood that taking this fight to court wasn't just for him or Rayner. It was for every student who would come after. The next evening, he sat alone on the dorm floor, surrounded by evidence that had once been scattered fragments but now formed a perfectly aligned timeline. He felt grounded, afraid, angry, ready. He opened his laptop, found a reputable civil rights firm in London, and began drafting an email. He hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that once the email went out, there was no turning back. His finger hovered over the send button. Before he could press it, a notification flashed across his screen. A new email sent directly to the encrypted mailbox that only the Whisper network had access to. Subject line: "We need to talk. We can help." Malik's eyes narrowed. Inside was a short message, written with formal precision and quiet urgency. No signatures, no identifying details, beyond a law firm's encrypted header. It read, "We've been following your case. If you choose legal action, we are prepared to represent you pro bono. Our senior counsel has a personal interest in this matter." Attached was a single document. A CV. Malik opened it, expecting a mid-level attorney, or perhaps a civil rights advocate. Instead, he froze. The profile belonged to a figure he knew from history books, news archives, and long-buried Cambridge controversies. Judge Marcellus Heath, the first black judge ever nominated to serve on Cambridge's Board of Appeals. Rejected, not for merit, but for daring to challenge the racial bias embedded in their admission criteria. His rejection had sparked protests decades ago. Then silence, then disappearance from Cambridge discourse entirely. Until now. Malik kept reading, breath unsteady. Heath had become one of the most respected civil rights litigators in the UK, famous for dismantling discriminatory structures in education and employment. And at the bottom of his CV, beneath decades of accolades, one line stood out in bold italics: specialization, institutional discrimination in academic environments. Malik understood immediately. History wasn't just repeating. It was coming for vengeance. A second message arrived instantly after the first. An audio file. Malik clicked play, and a steady, familiar voice spoke with calm gravity. "I knew Rayner. I know Crowley. And now I know you. If you're ready to fight, I'll open the door they once slammed on me." The courtroom felt colder than Malik expected. Too white, too polished, too pristine for the kind of truth about to be dragged across its floor. He sat beside Judge Marcellus Heath, who was no longer a judge in title but carried the quiet authority of one in every gesture. Heath had a way of grounding the room, making even the most confident figures on Cambridge's legal team shift uncomfortably in their seats. His presence alone seemed like the first crack in the facade the university had spent decades maintaining. This was no ordinary hearing. The gallery was filled with reporters, students, alumni, activists, and professors from universities across the world. Cambridge had insisted on a closed proceeding, but Heath fought for transparency, and won. Now cameras lined the back wall, their red dots blinking like watchful eyes ready to record history, the way the institution had never allowed it to be written. The case was simple in premise, devastating in implication. Malik Jensen versus Cambridge University for academic sabotage, misconduct, discrimination, and intellectual exploitation. Cambridge came armed with a battalion of attorneys. Their suits were crisp, their voices polished, their expressions locked into professional neutrality. But neutrality was just another mask for control. Heath understood that better than anyone. Before the proceedings began, he glanced calmly at Malik, a reminder that the fight ahead would not be clean, but it would be necessary. The hearing opened with Cambridge's defense. They moved quickly to establish that Malik was a promising yet inexperienced student, who misinterpreted the complexity of academic frameworks. They framed his discoveries as misunderstandings amplified by online fervor. They portrayed the redacted drafts as obsolete exercises, Rayner's thesis as unfinished work, and Malik's claims as emotionally driven projections from a student overwhelmed by douche and rigor. Every sentence was designed to diminish him without ever directly insulting him. Racism disguised as decorum. But Heath did not respond immediately. He watched. He observed their tactics. Let them believe they were in control of the narrative. Because the moment they finished, he shifted the entire room. Heath began by laying out the timeline, not with bombast but with methodical clarity. He presented each piece of evidence like a bead on a string, drawing connections that were impossible to overlook. The leaked memo, the psychiatric smear, the tenure clause, Rayner's disappearance, the redacted drafts, Cambridge's selective enforcement of academic integrity. The gallery leaned in. Even the judge overseeing the case shifted in his seat, eyebrows drawn. Then came the testimonies. The first was from a former student, a quiet young woman, now working as a researcher in Canada. She described how Crowley had routinely dismissed her work during her time at Cambridge, how he had lowered her grades with comments that questioned her conceptual discipline, how she had eventually changed advisors out of fear that staying in Crowley's orbit would end her career before it began. Another student followed a man from Kenya who had once been a top performer in his cohort. He testified that Crowley encouraged him to choose more reasonable research goals, only to later praise near-identical work produced by a white peer. The discrimination was never explicit. That was the brilliance of it. It was always woven into feedback, expectation, guidance. Elise's testimony shook the room. She detailed how she discovered Crowley's redacted drafts, how she witnessed him manipulate grading scales, how she uncovered internal memos discussing the strategic suppression of Rayner's findings. She spoke with calm precision, each detail cutting deeper into the polished image Cambridge had tried to protect. And then she revealed something Malik hadn't expected. Years before she met Malik, Elise had filed a private complaint about Crowley, one that mysteriously disappeared from university records. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly when she described the moment she realized she had been professionally punished, not for incompetence, but for curiosity. Then came the proof. Projected on large screens for the court and viewers worldwide, Malik's demonstration appeared in sequence, the skipped step, the gasp, the structure of the solution undeniable in its accuracy. Even Crowley, sitting stiffly behind Cambridge's counsel, could not hide the brief flicker of panic in his eyes as the equations unfolded across the display. Heath then introduced the most devastating evidence, Rayner's original thesis. The courtroom was silent as Malik's and Rayner's work were shown side by side. The parallels were unmistakable, not plagiarized, aligned, two brilliant minds solving the same truth across different decades. And Crowley's initials, scribbled in the margins of the redacted draft, darkened the air around them. The academic legacy being unmasked wasn't simply flawed. It was stolen, piece by piece. The courtroom watched a man's empire crumble, and yet Crowley remained expressionless, detached, strangely calm, because he knew something Heath didn't. The twist came when Heath called for the panel of board members to testify. One of them, a silver-haired academic with a trembling voice, stared at the evidence in front of him. His posture cracked with each new document revealed. When asked whether he had ever seen the 2006 redacted draft before, his silence was as telling as confession. When pressed further, he lowered his gaze. The moment felt suspended in air. He admitted quietly, painfully, that the board had known from the beginning that Crowley's limit was solvable, that the draft circulated internally years before Crowley presented the theorem publicly, that they had chosen silence to preserve the university's reputation during a period when Cambridge faced declining international rankings. Gasps filled the room. The admission didn't just implicate Crowley. It implicated the institution itself. Heath stood slowly, letting the shock wash over the courtroom. He didn't need theatrics. The truth was louder than anything he could say. But Cambridge's counsel scrambled. They argued the statement was misremembered, that the witness was under stress, that no official documentation existed to prove his claim. They tried to deconstruct the confession before it could settle. But Heath knew the strategy. When institutions can't deny truth, they discredit truth-tellers. He stepped forward, and without raising his voice, he delivered the final blow. He presented the board's own internal email chain, a series of messages discussing the strategic management of Crowley's limit. including language about protecting intellectual assets and avoiding leaks from underrepresented students who might misunderstand structural hierarchy. The courtroom atmosphere turned suffocatingly still. The judge stared at the screen, as though he had never seen corruption laid out so plainly. Cameras clicked. Crowley's composure fractured for the first time. His hand twitched. His jaw tensed. His legacy sat exposed, naked under the fluorescent lights of truth. The prosecution attempted to regain control, but the momentum had shifted entirely. Malik wasn't simply defending himself anymore. He was exposing a system. Still, the institution wasn't ready to collapse. As the defense scrambled for footing, Crowley whispered to his lawyers. A frantic exchange followed. They pulled out a final piece of paper, one more attempt to throw the trial into chaos. They claimed the psychiatric evaluation was real, not as medical fact, but as justification. They argued Malik had been flagged early in his term for instability, that the university had a responsibility to protect him from himself, that his current actions were evidence of emotional spiraling under academic pressure. The gallery erupted. Keith rose immediately, demanding the evaluation be dismissed as falsified and unethical. But while the judge considered the objection, Cambridge seized the moment to shift narrative, painting Malik as fragile, dramatic, unreliable. This was the unexpected twist the institution had saved for their darkest hour. Malik felt the room tighten around him again. Not because the accusations carried truth, but because they carried history. The same history that had drowned Rayner, buried complaints, and silenced brilliance for generations. But before the defense could finish, the judge raised his hand. The room quieted. He looked over the evidence, every file, every testimony, every contradiction, and then turned to Crowley, his jaw set. His voice carried through the courtroom with startling force. He was halting the proceedings, not dismissing them, halting them, to open a full inquiry, not just into Crowley, but into Cambridge's academic integrity as a whole. The judge ordered immediate seizure of university archives for forensic review, and the room erupted as Cambridge's counsel tried to block the motion, revealing just how much more they were trying to hide. The air inside the grand lecture hall felt heavy, as though the foundations themselves were trembling under the weight of truth. The judge's order had echoed in every corner, archives sealed, forensic review initiated, university counsel scrambling. In those tense hours that followed, whispers spread faster than wildfire. Decades of hidden papers, suppressed theses, erased names, and repressed brilliance were now all up for official scrutiny. The legacy of Thaddeus Crowley, once untouchable, began to fracture under the glare of exposure. Overnight, Cambridge shifted from bastion of prestige to a fortress under siege. Board members met behind closed doors. Administrative offices buzzed with urgent communications. Faculty who once sat in silent complicity now weighed the risks of staying silent. Letters were shuffled, memos re-examined, digital locks cracked, and countless long-buried documents resurfaced. What had been buried as rumor and fear now flooded every corridor and email chain of the institution. Hundreds of pages implicating systematic racial bias, academic sabotage, and covert discrimination going back decades. By midday, the culmination was inevitable. The university released a public statement. Crowley had tendered his resignation. It read with mechanical formality at first, but beneath the layers, the tremor was unmistakable. The institution admitted that the investigation uncovered unacceptable academic misconduct, abuse of power, and failure to protect student integrity. The statement promised a historic apology, a review of all past evaluations under Crowley's supervision, and a full restitution plan for those harmed. It was the first time in centuries that Cambridge had publicly acknowledged institutional wrongdoing. A seismic shift. For Malik, the moment felt surreal. He watched the press conference on a laptop screen, the university's crest behind the new interim provost. The crowd's questions sharp and accusatory, the sorrow feigned but the consequence real. When the apology concluded, cameras flashed, recorders clicked, but his eyes were fixed on a single empty podium beside the lectern. That belonged to Crowley, now empty, a symbol of greatness undone. Emails flooded Malik's inbox almost immediately. Offers arrived from internal committees, reinstatement into courses, a full scholarship covering tuition and living costs, an honorary award recognizing academic courage and integrity. The rewards were generous, laden with prestige. It was Cambridge attempting to paper over the wounds with privilege, to reclaim the narrative by placing a trophy in his hands. For a moment the glitter seemed bright. The future he had envisioned when he first stepped through those oak doors flickered in his mind. Acceptance, stability, the brilliance recognized, not erased. But as he sat among the glowing screen light and blinking notifications, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressed down harder. He remembered the erased drafts, the anonymous mails, the psychiatric traps, the silent departures, the students forced out. He remembered that the victory was never meant to be about him. It was meant to protect a system. So he closed the laptop. He collected the offers and folded them away, like contracts meant for another story. He packed up the final paper copies of Rayner's thesis, the internal memos, the confidential evaluations, and the files Elise had managed to smuggle before her suspension. He stood over them, letting the gravity of truth settle like dust on old leather. He realized that the restitution Cambridge proposed would offer comfort, but not justice. It would offer safety, but not change. Because change required not a return to status quo, but the building of something new. In the days that followed, Cambridge's internal audit expanded. Departmental chairs resigned, tenure reviews were paused, scholars came forward with testimonies dating back 20, 30, 40 years, one after the other. Names of black and brown mathematicians whose work had vanished resurfaced, their contributions once ignored or buried, suddenly part of a public ledger of erasure. The mathematics department announced it would rename Crowley's limit, not in honor, but in condemnation. The theorem would be archived under a new designation, suppressed legacy theorem. A scholarship fund would be established for underrepresented students. But Malik refused to endorse it. He believed a scholarship was not enough. Recognition was not enough. What was needed was structural overhaul, transparency, auditing of legacy theorems, archival access, and protections against academic sabotage wrapped in prestige. Cambridge's apology felt hollow to many. Words meant to heal but delivered too late. For Malik, the symbolic collapse of Crowley's legacy was bittersweet. A rare victory in a war of hidden atrocities. He acknowledged death of the myth, but refused to celebrate with endorsement beyond his own resolve. Instead, he channeled the moment into action. He understood the weight that brilliance carried when shackled by prejudice and tradition. He saw how legacy spaces weaponized exclusion under the guise of rigor. He knew that for every talent like his, hungry, brilliant, ambitious, there were dozens more trapped by invisible barriers. Doors that looked open, but locked from the inside. Tests that looked neutral, but were engineered for failure. Traditions dressed as neutrality, but rooted in hierarchy. That night, in the dim glow of a low desk lamp, Malik dug through the final box he had boxed up earlier. Inside lay Rayner's thesis, the redacted draft, the investigator's memos, mental health weaponization records, hundreds of testimonies, affidavits, student statements, alumni letters. He stacked them carefully on the desk. He opened a new document on his laptop, titled simply,
New Foundation.
Lines of thought emerged. Structural plans. Framework proposals. A blueprint. More than a school. A movement. He pictured a place not built like the old ivy towers, not cloaked in legacy, stone walls and dusty portraits, but built for brilliance. Built for those erased. Built for those who had been told you don't belong, only to belong all along. In the weeks that followed, word spread among networks, activists, former students, community leaders, and young prodigies across cities. Emails came from math clubs in Detroit, after-school programs in Atlanta, community centers in New York. They asked if Malik was serious, if he would offer mentorship, classes, opportunities, access. They sent stories of gifts wasted, dreams deferred, potential buried under prejudice and neglect. He responded not with promises but planning, contracts drawn up, legal advice taken, curriculum drafted, scholarships pledged through independent funds, community engagement proposed, outreach to high schools, underfunded districts, communities where education was a flicker, where brilliance often had nowhere to grow. Cambridge watched. The administration, fresh from their public apology, watched. Alumni withdrew quietly. Some applauded the direction, others bristled. Change always stung, but there was no turning back. At a small rented loft in Harlem, where the skyline stretched like a promise beyond concrete and history, Malik stood before a rough chalkboard mounted on a wooden frame. The room was modest. No oak benches, no velvet drapes, no stone arches. Just chance and will. A whiteboard marker in his hand, empty chairs waiting. He thought of the first time he walked into that hallowed hall at Cambridge. The eyes, the judgment, the silence, and how beneath that silence, giants slept, potential unawakened. He erased the faint line he had drawn, and began writing again. Not a theorem this time, but a mission statement. A place for those erased by legacy. A place for minds built to question. A place for truth. As he drew the words, the empty chairs felt less like absence, and more like invitation. Invitation to brilliance. Invitation to belong. Invitation to rewrite history. And somewhere beyond the high ceilings, beyond the legacy stones, the echo of a fallen legacy trembled. As Malik steps back to view the chalkboard's first words, his phone pings. An encrypted message flashes. They know. Expect a visit. The air in the lecture hall of Malik's institute felt different from any auditorium he had ever entered before. Gone were the carved wood benches, the portraits of stoic white scholars, the cold stone walls echoing with centuries of exclusion. Instead, the room blossomed with bright light from tall windows, simple chairs in neat rows, and a whiteboard framed by banners reading, "Knowledge for every mind, and no limit without opportunity." Names of past students, black, brown, first-generation immigrant, lined the walls. Face, dreams, proof. Malik stood at the front, steady and composed. Years had carved him leaner, his eyes calmer, but more determined. The awkward anxiety he once felt stepping into that grand Cambridge hall was gone. Now he carried purpose. Before him sat a room full of young black and brown students, 14 to 19 years old. Their skin tones varied, their backgrounds layered in hardship and hope. Some cradled worn notebooks stained with coffee rings, others balanced tablets loaded with scribbled equations. All of them had heard the story, how a boy from the Bronx cracked a theorem designed to exclude him, how institutional prestige had tried to bury the truth, how that truth had refused to stay buried. But in this moment, those stories were no longer warnings, they were foundation. Malik tapped the whiteboard marker against the edge of the ledge, eyes sweeping across the room. He began to write, not some abstract limit, but the first lines of a new curriculum. He wrote bold letters, "Foundations of Inclusive Mathematics." Beneath he sketched out a roadmap, theory, history, context, community mathematics, open proofs. Students leaned forward. It wasn't just math they were signing up for, it was reclamation. For decades, brilliance like theirs had been filtered out, not on merit, but on legacy, background, silence. But here at this institute, legacy was redefined as opportunity, background was celebrated, silence was broken. As the lecture progressed, Malik guided them through the narrative of his own journey, not as myth but as caution and promise. He traced the arc from that first Cambridge lecture hall, when eyes turned in suspicion, through erased notes, sabotage, leaking drafts, public exposure, trial, institutional collapse. But he didn't linger in the darkness. He focused instead on the turning points, the folder rediscovered, the network of allies, the legal fight for truth, the students who forgave silence and demanded justice. Each milestone was not just his victory, but theirs too, their possibility. By the time he chalked the final equation, no longer a limit, but a flourish of transformation, the students sat in silence long after the board filled. That silence was not emptiness, but weight. The weight of possibility, the weight of inheritance, the weight of knowing they belonged. After class, Malik moved among them, quietly, attentively. He didn't announce himself as founder or savior. For him, titles meant little. What mattered was access. What mattered was giving them room to think, to fail, to build. He handed out notebooks and pens, offered open hours, promised mentorship, and invited them into a collective network rooted in mutual respect and shared struggle. These weren't favors, these were rights finally given. Outside, the institute's influence began quietly spreading. Articles appeared in education journals, a new model for mathematics education, reimagining inclusion in STEM. When the margin becomes center, former critics, silenced by scandal or shame, watched the institute's growth with nervous respect. Alumni of various universities, many of whom had once echoed intellectual gatekeeping, visited and asked to contribute. Some left quietly, others stayed, but with eyes open. Malik refused any honorary titles. When donors pushed to name the institute after him, he declined. He insisted the name be a statement of mission, not ego. The Bridge Academy for Mathematical Empowerment. The name reflected what the place was meant to do, not celebrate one person, but elevate many. Futures. Generation. Incrementally, the curriculum expanded. Alongside rigorous mathematics, students studied history of science, institutional bias, philosophy of knowledge, and community problem solving. Projects ranged from designing solar panel calculations for underprivileged housing, reworking water distribution algorithms, to rewriting statistical models for education access in underserved cities. Math stopped being an ivory tower abstraction. It became life, community, justice. With each graduating class, stories came back. A young woman from Detroit built a nonprofit tutoring network. A teenager from Atlanta won a national mathematics award after solving a problem previously considered too advanced. A group of students from Harlem designed an open-source platform for peer-reviewed mathematics. Their success wasn't just personal. They were part of a lineage, a legacy, a living proof that brilliance could flourish when nurtured, not hidden. Over time, the name of the old theorem, Crowley's limit, faded from academic syllabi. Textbooks replaced it with references to systemic bias, institutional erasure, and suppressed talent. Theorems no longer wore names like monuments, but were taught as ideas subject to scrutiny, growth, and communal development. In its place, Malik's institute became a beacon. The new generation came not to be filtered, but to be elevated, not to prove they belonged, but to prove they could change the rule. Still, Malik never forgot the cost. He kept the original documentation, Rayner's thesis, the redacted drafts, the legal filings, the school of erased names, in a locked archival room at the institute. He called it the Vault of Memory. It was never meant to punish. It was meant to remember, for the students, for the ones erased, for the ones to come. A silent monument, not to one man's legacy, but to the resilience of truth. He visited the vault quietly at night. He didn't lock it behind secrecy, but behind dignity. He believed that truth preserved wasn't just a record, it was protection against forgetting, because systems like the one he had battled thrived on silence, on oblivion, on replacement, and the only way to defeat that was by building memory, community, and visibility. The institute became a legal entity, with transparent admissions, financial aid, outreach programs, and public accountability. It published annual reports, not of student GPAs only, but of backgrounds retention, mentorship hours, community impact. It invited oversight. It embraced scrutiny. Because Malik believed that justice, unlike tradition, should never be sacred, it should always be evolving. On a crisp autumn afternoon, 5 years after that first class, the institute held its annual legacy lecture. Students and alumni gathered in the modest loft space, now padded with rugs, filled with sunlight, warmed by vibrancy and hope. Malik walked to the front. Behind him, on the screen, scrolls names old and new. Scholars, engineers, activists, teachers, taking up space they had never been invited to before. He began the lecture by erasing the chalkboard clean. Every inch wiped away. Then he drew a single line. A horizon. He wrote beneath it simple words: "We define what comes next." The room was hushed, not by reverence, but by recognition. For those who felt erased, overlooked, silenced, this was their horizon. Then he paused. He stepped back. He looked at the sea of faces before him, determined, curious, hungry. Because this institute wasn't his final equation to solve. It was their beginning, their problem to challenge, their legacy to build. And just as he stepped away from the chalkboard, the overhead projector flickered. From the back of the room, a quiet voice rose. Not loud, not demanding, not rehearsed. A young black girl, 15, clutching a battered notebook, raised her hand. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the sharpness of possibility. She asked, "Sir, I think I found a flaw in your proof." The room froze, not in shock, but in possibility. A murmur rose, not of doubt, but of curiosity. Because for all that had been broken, erased, reconstructed, for all the theorems, rewritten and histories reclaimed, the truth remained alive, fluid, mutable, waiting. As Malik turned back to the board, marker in hand once more, the empty chairs felt less like seats and more like open doors. The institute, the legacy, the struggle, they weren't over. They had only just begun. And somewhere between chalk dust and captured silence, the horizon line shifted again. The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. As Malik's hand hovered above the board, the next generation leaned forward. The future waited on the edge of a new equation. They tried to silence him. bury the truth, and rewrite history in their image. But truth doesn't stay buried when courage speaks. If you believe stories like Malik's should never be forgotten, type yes. If you believe in justice,